Hello, and welcome to the very first official episode of the Big Screen Book Club, the podcast that celebrates the loving relationship between literature and film and seeks to answer the biggest question of them all. Was the book really better? I'm Joseph Keim.
And I'm Clarisse Lockray, and after a long, hard month of reading, we finally reached our first episode! Yeah! This month, we'll be tackling Louisa May Alcott's classic novel Little Women and the magnificent Greta Gerwig's cinematic take on the story. But before we tackle the film, let's take a look at the novel itself.
The now classic Little Women was written by Louisa May Alcott in 2 volumes in 1868 and 1869, titled Little Women and Good Wives. The story follows the March sisters, Jo, Meg, Beth and Amy, as they navigate life's many twists and turns from childhood to womanhood on the backdrop of the American Civil War in Concord, Massachusetts. Many believe this book to be semi-autobiographical, as many of the book's features echo Alcott's own life, but I'm sure we'll touch on that later on.
The first volume was an immediate success, both commercially and critically, prompting Alcott to quickly squeeze out Good Wives just 3 months after its publication, before moving on to 2 sequels featuring the March sisters, Little Men and Jo's Boys.
The book is deemed to be the start of a whole new literary genre that combines elements from romantic children's fiction and other sentimental novels. It's also thought to contain the very first instances of the all-American girl, drawing from each of the sisters. The book's historical significance is undeniable and is considered by many to be a crucial feminist text. But above all else, it's a bloody good read. Clarisse, how did you find the read?
Well, this is interesting because I think I did read Little Women when I was myself a little woman, a small all-American girl, because it was just one of those books that you just read as like an American girl. It was that and Little House on the Prairie, Wizard of Oz, the classics.
Yeah.
But revisiting it, sort of now having seen the Greta Gerwig film, I think what I'm most struck by is, I guess it's just the differences in tone. And then I find it so interesting that, like, the actual novel is so based in Alcott's own beliefs that she was a transcendentalist. Well, her family was, that was her upbringing, which is this very sort of like morally strict, morally correct belief in the goodness of people. And, you know, you always have to do the best that you can. And I think she said that it drove her to be a perfectionist. And it's so interesting that so much the book is about that. It's about the girls kind of improving themselves morally. And then you watch the films, you watch the Greta Gerwig and the 1994, the Gillian Armstrong, and it's like, oh, these movies are way more interested in who Louisa May Alcott was as a person, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, when you read it for the first time, it strikes you, especially after seeing the films, how sort of non-linear the story tends to be. It feels less like a linear story than it is more like the adventures of the March sisters, where they'll all go off and do their own little things. And there's a few chapters dotted here and there where the sisters have their own little adventures that aren't featured in the films, where they just learn minor morals and figure out who they are and learn how to grow up on the backdrop of the Civil War.
There's so much moral learning.
It's a hell of a lot. They learn a lot of lessons, whether we're interested in it or not.
Just constantly learning the morals, getting that little Pilgrim's Progress book out to read it. Like, it's so striking, I think, having seen the films, because the films, you know, the modern films, just not interested in that at all. Well, I mean, maybe a little bit, but it feels so stark, like the difference between the two.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you consider Gerwig's film and the way that the story pans out, whether it be its sort of topsy-turvy timeline or the way that the film ends in a way to provide Louisa May Alcott with the ending that a lot of people have assumed is the one that she wanted. It's interesting to go back and read what was actually there when she put pen to paper, because there are a few moments in the book, especially later on when Jo puts her stories to Mr. Dashwood, where you learn a lot of lessons about what it's actually like to sell stories and to write books in the time that Alcott did. It's quite interesting to see, as it's deemed quite semi-autobiographical, it's interesting to see the process that Alcott went through, because the moments that we see Jo processing her book and her stories all come after Little Women had already come out and after it had been such an immense success. It's really interesting to see how the films take that as well and interpret it for the screen and sort of change the story underneath Jo's banner to give Alcott almost the story that people think that she would have wanted.
Well, yeah, because what I found fascinating is Jo's journey as a writer in the book. Like, there's never an explicit moment where her struggle is about her being a woman writer. Like, her struggle in the book is that she's writing all these sensationalist stories and she's so ashamed of it because oh, mommy, lovely moral mommy might find out. And that's the reason that she doesn't want it published under her name. While the movie has, and the 1994 movie both do a thing where I think in both of them, she wants to publish under a male name, which is either reflected in Alcott's own life, but she didn't really write about it in the book, which is what I find interesting. Presumably because, everybody just knew already, the women reading it were not going to be like, oh my God,
yeah,
you had difficulty publishing as a woman? I had no idea. They were like, yeah, obviously. We're women alive after the Civil War. We know what's happening.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of look at the world of publishing. And it's one part that really frustrated me about the book is how immediately Professor Bhaer sort of snaps at the idea of sensationalist writing, because she already has so many nerves when it comes to publishing the books, even if they're not under her name or under a different name. Professor Bhaer really stamps out the idea of sensationalist writing to the degree where, even though he doesn't know that Jo is the person writing these stories, she still ends up burning about 3 months worth of work. And it's like, dude, that's not cool. Everyone holds up Bhaer now because we've seen the sexy fella from 2019 Little Women. But damn, he's a kind fella, but that is not on. I'm consistently upset about that fact.
Well, do we want to talk about Bhaer? Because, that's one of the most dramatic changes from the book.
Oh, I
know. In the book, she just keeps going on about how, ugly and old he is.
Alcott
very
is
homely.
really, really savage to him. It's not fair.
Which I think it's because if we are interpreting this idea that she really didn't want Jo to get married, and she did it very, stubbornly and angrily and annoyingly, she was like, I'm gonna make her marry the ugliest dude. To be like, it's gonna be as unromantic as possible. And it does seem like, she's so anti-marriage up until the point that Beth dies, Meg's gone, Amy gets married to Laurie, and she's just like, oh, God damn, I've got nothing to do now. Might as well get married to this German guy. Which I like that they replicated to some degree in the movie with that amazing, women, they have souls and hearts and that. But I am so lonely. That whole speech is not in the book, but it's replicating I think the chapter's literally called All Alone.
Yeah.
It's replicating the moment in Jo's life where she kind of realizes she doesn't really want to get married, but she feels like she might as well at this point because she doesn't really have anyone else to hang out with, so she just marries into a friend. It's kind of strange, but I think the movie just about pulls it off.
It's quite sad the way that the book puts it on, because it's clear that that's not what Alcott had planned for Jo. However, I think Gerwig's film does quite a good job of almost flipping that on its head, because while in the book he's quite homely and awkward, just as Jo describes herself, and the way that the book plays out, it seems like it doesn't seem completely natural a step for Jo to take, but it's more plausible than her ending up marrying Laurie after she turned him down. But the thing that Gerwig does is, by making Bhaer hot, she makes him almost more tempting to Jo and makes us feel like she's more likely to end up with him, even though obviously in the way that she dissects the ending, it's semi-clear that she chooses her work over Bhaer, whereas in the book she would choose Bhaer. It's an interesting take, and I think making him hot almost, it offers Alcott the story that she would have wanted, I think, in a really strange way.
Well, yeah, because what I find so interesting about the ending in the film is that the publisher's going, well, she has to be married. It's so stupid. Like, of course she's got to be married. And then and Jo relents and goes, okay, fine, if it's going to get my book sold. And then you cut to like Jo's real life in quotation marks. And the whole sequence of her running after after Bhaer, like, it feels it's so over the top in its like romanticism that it feels fake. It feels like Jo's kind of taking the piss if she's writing the story of the movie, because she's kind of running in the rain and she's running to the station, and even the way that Saoirse Ronan delivers the line of like, oh, your life isn't empty, like, I want you to stay, da, 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 da. It feels like a Richard Curtis romantic comedy. Like, that's how over the top it feels. And so I like that you could come away from Little Women thinking, oh, that's just some silly fantasy that she wrote about. It didn't actually happen, even though he is in the final scene, which kind of suggests that they did hook up. But I think that scene in particular, I think you could come away from it just going, oh, that's what she's telling the publisher happened. That's not what actually happened to Jo. And then that ties into the hotness. Like, he's just ridiculous. He's like too hot. It's like silly how hot he is.
It is silly. It's awful. But I mean, it's an interesting way to look at it. And even though it's quite over the top come the end, that same attitude, I think, can be applied to most of the film, especially on the reflection on the March's childhood. You could say just as easily that these images that we're seeing and these flashbacks to their youth that we're seeing, we could, with any of the liberties that the film takes with the book, we could say that these moments are from Jo's Little Women rather than Alcott's Little Women. I think it's an interesting way to dissect the film, and it's a very clever setup to say, but basically any moment in the film that sticks out as poor, you say, whatever, it's Jo's Little Women. That's not the real Little Women.
Yeah, and I think that ties into the messing with the timeline, is because it's all filtered through memory. And it's not things as they happened, it's things as she remembers them or as she wrote them down. And to me, it does solve, like, I mean, I should say, I think Little Women is a brilliant, amazing book, but I think the way in which it has, not that it's even aged, in the way that as a modern reader, maybe it's more difficult for us to swallow, is kind of the courtship aspect of it. It is kind of a bit like, okay, so Laurie at one point is gonna get married to every single sister, and it's all, there's the romances in the book feel quite sudden, and sometimes they just feel like they kind of come out of nowhere. And I think Gerwig did a really good job of, for a modern audience, not only making us believe that these romances could be real, but also using the timeline aspect to kind of be able to skip over things and truncate things, so that, because like you don't really see a lot of Laurie and Amy's courtship. It's very like truncated and squished together and talked about, in different scenes. But she does it in a way where, oh, you really do believe that these two people spent time with each other and fell in love in a meaningful way. As opposed to in the book, it just kind of feels like, well, Beth died and Laurie was there, so...
Beth going was really horrible. It's really upsetting, but only because it's almost so serene and sort of simple. It's almost like she just drifts away, like she were becoming a force ghost, just sort of vanishing.
She's Yoda. Yoda having a little nap and then dying.
Yeah. Yoda reading Little Women and being like, yeah, oh, I'm so Beth.
I'm such a Beth. I'm such a Beth. Yeah, and I love that. I'm so happy that Gerwig kept that line about her not saying I'm not afraid, because that's such a big, I don't know, her whole death scene is so sad because she does that whole thing of like, I never imagined, you know, all these girls, all they ever do is talk about their dreams. Amy wants to be an artist, Jo wants to be a writer, Meg wants dresses, marriage, she kind of wants like multiple things, but Beth, that's the thing. Beth never, every single time in the book where Beth talks about what she wants, it's something she wants in the present. Is, I wish Father was home, I wish we could be together, and then to get to her death scene and she says, yeah, I never saw a life for myself because I knew that wasn't going to happen. I knew that was for my sisters. Like, that's so heartbreaking to me.
Yeah.
That, yeah, she just knew, like, all along, I'm going to die young because, you know, look at my face. I got a dying young face.
It's honestly, it's genuinely heartbreaking. It's just her almost consigning to death and sort of speaking as though she always knew that it was coming, and she always knew that she'd never have the life that her sisters had. But even at like the start of the book, even in the first half, she's such a humbling and warm presence, and all of the moments that she shares, not only in the book but in Gerwig's film, the moments that she spends with Mr. Lawrence are so warm and loving that you can't you can't really conceive how grim and sort of depressing her end comes to be.
One of my favorite things about the movie is that Gerwig kept that relationship with Mr. Lawrence intact and really spent the time to develop it, because it would be so easy to cut out. The 1994 movie doesn't really delve into it. A piano just like turns up one day.
Yeah, they just
like,
they just pull a curtain back and there is a piano.
Yeah, bing bing piano, and then Claire Danes does her like Claire Danes cry face. But like that relationship to me is so essential to who Beth is as a person, and the bond that she manages to form with Mr. Lawrence is like a kind of like another father figure. It's so beautiful and it's so pure, and the Chris Cooper when he's sitting on the step and he's crying because he's remembering his dead daughter, and how Beth reminds him of her.
Honestly, that moment is my tear trigger every single time. I've seen the film about 6 times now, and I cry at that moment every single time without fail. It's never gotten better.
It's just like, and this is the thing, I think, the casting, do we want to talk about the casting just in general? Because I feel like it's so perfect.
It's brilliant, honestly. The one thing that struck me the most about the casting is how well all of the March sisters can play their much younger selves. Florence Pugh especially.
I'm Amy.
Oh my god! Some of the line reads of these characters when they're younger is so funny, almost just unintentionally. The first moment that we see them when they're younger, when Jo is curling Meg's hair, and her hair comes away, and Beth is in the background saying, "Why is your hair off?" It's brilliant.
And I think it's so important that they had to all be played by the same actors throughout the film. I think that's one thing that doesn't work about the 1994 version.
Yeah, how Kirsten Dunst just vanishes.
between you need that like sense of continuation, because Amy's character development is one of the most significant character developments in the entire book, and like her maturity, like it needs to be a journey, as opposed to if you switch actors, it's just like, I'm a child, now I'm not a child. It doesn't feel as much work put into it, because that's the whole thing, is like the March sisters are putting work into their character constantly and trying to improve. It's not just about them growing up.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, Amy takes the harshest turn, I think, where she sort of almost, she welcomes herself into high society almost. It's very clear from the moments that you see with her and Aunt March how much Aunt March is influencing her changes, and she almost feels like a martyr for the family when she consigns that she has to marry rich and she has to be the one who keeps the Marches afloat. And it's interesting to see the trajectory from there, from backwards to making a mold of her foot for Laurie.
And I think Florence Pugh's, like, she's so good at, it's that mouth when she does her little like grimace, her downturned mouth.
Yeah.
Because when she's doing very, very young Amy, it's kind of the pouty, spoiled brat thing going on. And then when she does it when she's older, it's like, it's more of there's like a disgust to it.
Yeah.
Especially when she sees Laurie, and Laurie's being like a big old drunk and speaking French and shit. And,
Yeah.
and she's so...
Honestly, she's a complete savage in that moment. I actually physically made the note, Amy is a savage.
Yeah, but Laurie's being a real asshole in that scene.
He is being a bit of a dick.
He really is. Well, I would say more so in the book. In the book, it's much more subtle, the change in Laurie, but here he's fully like, I got my ladies, my cravate is undone. Je parle un petit peu de français, oui, got my little drink. Like, he's really going for it in that scene.
He's a little bit cheekier in the book, I find, especially in the first half. He's a little bit more subtle. He's always quite polite, but he's a little bit jovial with Jo. But I think Gerwig sort of brings out the worst in him when we actually see him drunk and stumbling around and grabbing Amy by the wrist. It's all quite a lot, and even in moments where he's being quite horrible, to be honest, especially with Meg when she goes away to her ball. He's quite rude, but he's almost quite well-meaning. He's just a bit oblivious. But whereas a little bit later on, he becomes a little bit more vindictive and just a little bit generally meaner. And I think that's something that's brought out by him being kind of just a spoilt brat, especially after being turned down by Jo, the one thing that he kind of expected to be a sure thing. It's interesting to see how Gerwig brings out the worst in that character, but still making him kind of easy to root for later on.
Yeah, and I wonder whether it has to do with the way that Gerwig treats class in the film, because it's so integral to the book, the idea that the Marches are always being surrounded by people who are of higher class than them. And this idea that they were once rich but are now no longer, and that like none of them are kind of dealing with it well, except for Beth. She's cool. And I don't know. It's interesting because the movie doesn't disregard that aspect, but I think it understands that as a modern audience, like we're not gonna click into like the class differences as easily, because I don't know, I feel like in the book it's like, oh, the Vaughan family are English, so we feel very intimidated by that. You know, to a modern audience, like, that doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah. We don't fear the British anymore.
Exactly. Like, there's all these, like, very subtle things about, oh, Meg wearing this type of silk or, you know, she's got to have this glove, but she's not got the right glove on. There's a constant sort of negotiation in the book that the girls are always trying to, I guess, appear higher of class than they actually are, which is incredibly hard to translate in a modern film.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe that's why Laurie is characterized like that, because in the book, what he's saying, he's kind of a moral corrector, because he's telling these girls, like, stop trying to act that like you're higher class than you are, and it's meant to be a lesson for them. But I think to modern eyes that seems really like stupid. Like, let Meg wear that dress. So I think it's just a clever way of reworking that. So now it's more about Laurie's character, that he's just a bit like judgmental.
Yeah, it's a little bit. Yeah, it sort of repurposes his attention to how happy they are as a poor family. Because I mean, initially when reading it, I always read it as sincerity, because it's very clear how happy they all are together, especially on those Christmas mornings that they spend together, and when they first receive that letter from their father, they're happy with what they have. But reading it that way is interesting, because Teddy never really seemed vindictive or, you know, or like he was looking down on the family up until that point. That is, yeah, I'm floored by that. Maybe Laurie is just a complete dick, and it didn't pass me by the whole time.
Well, no, because I think in the book, Laurie is correct, because Laurie is of a higher class but doesn't necessarily enjoy the privileges of it. And that's why he's attracted to, like, the humbleness of the March family. And so I think when he's being mean to Amy and to Meg, it's more out of a, like, this is why you're so morally good, is that you don't have very much, but you're still happy, and you still, you know, treasure each other. You know, you're not like all these other girls that I know who are vain and possessive and blah, 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 blah. But then I feel like in the movie, I don't know, in the movie, it comes across as something slightly different, and I think reflects more negatively on him, that it maybe has more to do with just his general affection with the family. I don't know.
Yeah, but I mean, his wealth almost becomes like a bargaining chip later on when he goes to propose to Amy, and despite how she feels about him, and despite how she didn't want to be with him just because he couldn't be with Joe, it definitely comes into play with Amy's feeling of martyrdom and trying to be what she needs to be for the March family as dictated by Aunt March. But I think the book sets it up so that he could have married any of them, really, up until the end of the first book. It could have gone any way. And even in the second book, when it reveals that Beth kind of slightly loves Laurie, which is something that I haven't seen the films tackle yet. But it's interesting to see how his struggle with his class and his struggle with being so deeply connected to a family who are so happy with the little that they have sort of translates both to the screen and to his story going forward after meeting the Marches.
You're right. I think it is. It's more in the movie. It's less about him being like a moral corrector, like him pointing out something that's true. It's more about his personal disdain for his wealth, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I feel that. I think Gerwig's film does a really good job of detailing how poor the Marches are, and even when compared to the Hummels, they've still got quite a lot. And I think that's almost exclusively down to the costume and set design, which is completely without fault for the whole film. Every single location in this film, I feel like I could just walk from memory. I remember being absolutely astounded the first time I saw this film at just how incredibly homely the March house feels. I was honestly blown away.
And the production design is so good because if you look at the details of the little items that they own, it's quite fancy. There's like little chandeliers and knickknacks and really beautiful paintings that I think suggest to like days of more wealth in the past. But now maybe the house is smaller, so it's all kind of collected together. I'm just thinking of the fireplace, and there's the two like glass candelabras next to it, and this like beautiful painting, which to me suggests something quite wealthy. But the house is very humble. Like it's really clever.
It feels almost like they're just like a couple of years out of time, and I think that's something that crops up in the film a few times actually, especially because obviously as a super fan going into it as a nightmare, I read through the whole movie companion book, and it was interesting to read how they conceptualize all of the costumes as though they were the styles of a couple of years behind, because they wouldn't have been able to afford the latest clothes, and they'd all be a little bit stunted. And even when the first time that we meet Amy, when she's painting, we can see that her art, though brilliant, is falling behind current trends as the person next to her is painting in a vastly different style.
Oh, yeah. He's doing like the impressionist thing, and she's like, God damn it, impressionists.
I know. It's a complete nightmare because she's brilliant. She's really good at what she does. She's just not quite there and just slightly out of time. It's a really nice touch.
Yeah, the costumes are really interesting because I follow a lot of historical costume experts on YouTube. They all hate Little Women. Hate it.
No.
Because, to be fair, well, this is the thing, but it's done very deliberately that there's a lot of modernity to the costumes. I mean, the hair being down is, outrageously anachronistic. But it works because, and I think someone's wearing Uggs at some point, which is crazy.
Oh, no.
but I think it's all done very deliberately because, Gerwig isn't making a fully faithful adaptation of Alcott's Little Women or of the period. Like, she's put so many changes in her film to make it like an old meets modern creation. Like, the characters all feel really modern, I think, especially like Jo in this could be kind of like Lady Bird. She's Lady Bird, but put in the Civil War period. And I don't think she's hesitant or like trying to, I don't know. It's very deliberate and very like, I want this book to feel 100% relatable to the audience that would have watched Lady Bird.
Yeah. I mean, Gerwig never keeps it from being Gerwig's Little Women. It's very much a product of her filmmaking techniques, because I went into this as a massive fan of Lady Bird. I'd never read or I'd never known anything about the story going into it. I was watching it exclusively because it was a Gerwig film, and you feel that right the way through. It does a similar thing with Lady Bird, quite literally, when it comes to the way that it reflects the March's memories, because Lady Bird feels almost like a scrapbook, almost like you're watching the events as Lady Bird will remember them later on. And I feel like Little Women does something similar with that really gorgeous orange haze and making everything seem and feel much livelier and more significant than maybe it would be in the future. It feels like Gerwig's film through and through, and I never felt like Alcott was taking over or there were any moments that stuck out and were only there to keep the story moving. It all feels incredibly natural. Yeah,
and like I love all the play fighting with Laurie and Jo, because then it's kind of like it's sort of like, well, it's Laurie and Jo, but it's also Saoirse Ronan and Timothée Chalamet. Like, it's blurring the lines between those two characters and those two actors, because obviously we watched them throughout the whole press tour for Lady Bird, and they seem like really good friends, and they seem like they have a bit of a brother-sister relationship. And so it just feels really interesting to me when that sort of outside world bleeds into a movie. And there were times where it feels like I'm just watching like Timmy and Saoirse messing around.
Yeah. Because the film lends itself really nicely to that. I think one of my favourite things that it does is it lends itself to the chaos and the messiness of home life with three sisters, whether or not it's in the 1800s or now. I mean, the way that it's been talked about to death, and I'm sure I've already spoken about it in one of my few articles on it. the way that the dialogue is layered up and stacked on top of each other so almost clumsily, and the way that they interact together with Jo and her sisters and with Jo and Laurie, it feels a little bit more scrappy, and it doesn't feel forced like it does in the original novel, because there are moments where Laurie mentions how he would scrap his friends, and I don't believe him even slightly. It's awful. Honestly, I think the direct word is thrash. He would thrash his friends, and I do not see that for Timothée Chalamet's Laurie at all.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of only see the college friends for like a split second in the movie. But do we?
And I'm glad they're introduced in the way that they are in the beach scene, because the scene where they're introduced before at Camp Lawrence is monumentally boring. And it's just Jo trying to interact and to integrate with the English boys who are cheating at croquet. But now when they roll it into the beach scene, they're able to roll up a few other plot points in it. And it really saves the pacing of the film.
Yeah. Yeah, there is quite a good, like, condensation of some of, like, condensing of the of what are separate incidents in the book, because the book does have this weird circular thing to it where it's like it's kind of the same thing over and over again, but the sisters react slightly differently each time.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few chapters in the book which have obviously been cut for time's sake, but some of them, when you're reading it, really, really drag. I remember I read this book before, and then I came back to it for the sake of the podcast. But when I read it through on the second time, and I got to the chapter Calls, I audibly groaned. It's honest, as much as I love the book and how beautifully whimsical it is, and how all of the sisters go on their own individual, adventures, there's a few of them that just are not interesting even slightly. I think both films, the 90s version and Gerwig's version, do a really good job of trimming the fat, even though there's a couple of scenes in the 90s version which I think probably could have been saved for sake of pacing and time. I think Gerwig is fine, but there's just a few chapters which really stick out as pretty dull, to be honest.
Yeah, which I think is because, like, reading them at the time must have been far more interesting or, like, relatable, because it'd be like, oh yeah, I remember when I went on a calls trip and it was very boring, and I met this kind of person and that kind of person, and I felt very awkward about my class. Like, I'm sure the readership at the time probably liked it more than we do.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to hang on to the fact that we're not exactly the target audience, because we're not young girls in the 1860s.
We're not. We are not, and I wish we could have one of them on the podcast today, but they're unavailable because they're dead. They're all dead.
Yeah, busy.
Being dead. Yeah, but I think that's the thing, though. That's the really important thing about adaptation, is I get quite frustrated by this concept of, like, faithfulness. Like, oh, they cut out this bit and they cut out this bit. And it's like, yes, because, like, film and literature are two different mediums, especially when you're dealing with an older novel. Like, you have to make the film for the audience of today and find a way in for them, because, so much about Little Women is universal and timeless and transcends culture and age and whatever, but, like, some things also don't.
Yeah.
and there's no point holding on to that stuff. It's more interesting to find a new way to communicate the ideas of those boring chapters, which I think is what, like, Greta Gerwig does. Like, she includes just enough of the day-to-day toil of the March Sisters that we get it without having to, go full.
Yeah, to sit through all of it.
We gotta meet, like, 10 different families, guys. Buckle up.
Yeah, I mean, what happens when it comes to adaptation is there's obviously the question of like why now, and why the film was being made in the year and the time and that it was. So what do you think Gerwig's reason was for making Little Women again in the moment that she did, especially as her second film, which is quite a bold step to take on one of the most timeless stories of all time, and obviously it's a big deal now, and we know how great it was, but it was quite a big risk. Why do you reckon she chose to take this up as her second project?
I think because, like, if you look at the ideas that she was trying to explore in Lady Bird, like, it is kind of the same thing. And it makes sense to me that someone who would have made Lady Bird would then kind of want to look to this novel and think, right, how can I interpret this through my specific vision and my voice? And that's the thing. I feel like it has less to do with the times we are living in, and more to do with where Gerwig is creatively in her career, because obviously she's done a lot. Like, Lady Bird was not the first thing that she did, but I think in choosing that specific character, like a younger character, more of a coming of age movie, that feels quite new compared to most of the stuff that she's done before. And I think a part of her must just want to have continued it and gone, well, I want to tell another story about coming of age. What's the most famous one in American literature for young women? Oh, Little Women. Bada bing, bada boom.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, now we know how good Greta Gerwig is at the coming of age story. Now we've got Barbie the movie to get excited for, something entirely new.
Who's playing Barbie again? It keeps changing.
Yeah, I think originally it was scoped for Margot Robbie, and then I think there was a rumour that Amy Schumer was Barbie, but I'm not sure yet.
Who's Barbie now?
Who's Barbie now? That's a whole podcast in itself, I think.
Oh, I think we've gone back to Margot. I think because it's a Lucky Chap. It's a Lucky Chap movie now. Which means it'll probably be quite good, right? Greta Gerwig, Lucky Chap, Margot Robbie.
Honestly, put Gerwig on anything and I'll be there day one.
Oh,
so
yeah. And
either way, I'll be there.
Honestly, put Margot Robbie on anything. Like, she knows what she's doing. This is a diversion. What if Margot Robbie was in Little Women? Which character would she play?
I feel like she'd be a good mommy, but then that would be like at the very start.
Oh,
Like she'd look too young to carry it all the way through, I think.
yeah. Well, we just gotta wait for Margot to age into the role, and then we circle back.
Then Gerwig can give her another call when she makes Little Women 2.
Little Women 2, womening harder. I just love it. I love it. One thing that I don't know whether it'd be interesting to discuss is like Jo. Like, the book is so interesting because there's so many references to Jo saying, like, I'm so angry that I was not born a boy, and I think it's because, like, to modernize, you go, oh, is Jo trans, or like did Jo like, is this a thing of Jo literally feels like I am not a woman, but
there was a wide theory that Alcott was trans herself, and that a lot of the film, and in fact no, a lot of the book is sort of written with that in mind, as obviously Alcott put herself a lot into Jo. And that's actually a question that we got from a listener, from Rachel, asking us about what we thought about the queer coding of Jo's character.
Well, yeah, because this is the thing, and like, I think it's just a really interesting question about how we interpret like older ideas of gender, when obviously these people did not have the language we have today. And so Jo didn't have any way to be like, hey, I think I'm trans. And I think there's two different and equally valid ways to interpret it. That yes, Jo identified as a man, but society, she didn't have the language for it. or he didn't have the language for it. Couldn't express it, socially too oppressed to live as he wanted to, or that, it's actually just a way, because like gender roles were so confining at the time, like any expression of masculinity within a woman was like, there was no way for women to express any form of masculinity. And so I think it's equally valid to look at it and say, well, this was Jo just, wanting to not be confined by such a strict idea of womanhood. And she saw things about masculinity that she wanted. She still identified as a woman, but she wanted the things that men were privileged to. And I think the movie does like a good enough job of being open to both interpretations, because the coding there is really through the costume, because Jo is constantly wearing like men's hats, waistcoats, like to the point that I think probably would be like quite ahistorical. Like it's very like masculine reading of clothing. And so then again, I think that's the thing, you can interpret it either as a thing, about how she's identifying, or just how she's wanting to express her own idea of femininity, of womanhood.
Yeah, I mean the gender sort of brackets of the time that the book was published and the time in which it is set was so rigid that I don't really think there would be any way for a book like this to be published and to be as popular as it was if they did have the language to sort of explain Jo as trans and sort of by association Alcott as trans. But it's interesting how Gerwig she does just enough to ask the question, I think.
Because that's the thing. I think there's so many instances in history where we go, oh, maybe, but we probably will never have any way of knowing, because it comes down to the language, and B, like the very concept of it. Like, how do you know that you're trans when literally that concept has never existed in your world? Like, you have no idea that could be a thing that exists. Like, I think that applies to so many historical figures, and we're probably just never going to know. And I think the best thing for Little Women is to be open to it. And if someone reads Jo as trans, then it's as valid as reading Jo as not trans. Like I think it's totally fine for those interpretations to live parallel with each other and be equally valid, because they are. Like, it's within the text, the evidence supports both, I think, equally.
I mean, that's the wonder of books, really, and the way that you're able to interpret them, especially Little Women being the brick of a book that it is. It's I'm glad that a queer sort of reading has arisen from such a popular book, from one that a lot of people have grown up reading even through the ages. I think it's very important that such a reading can come about for a book that's had such immense cultural significance. Yeah,
because that's the thing, like, those stories and people were out there. Like, they existed, and it's just, they didn't always have the most obvious ways to communicate it, so we have to go looking for it.
Yeah. Well, that leads us quite nicely on to our listener questions. Thank you to everybody who sent in questions. If you didn't this time and you'd like to for our next book and film combo, you can find us over on Twitter at BSBookPod, and we'll stick out a tweet when we need some questions from you, and we'll pick out our favourites and we'll see if we can answer them. First off, Ian Gibson asked quite an interesting question. He asks, can the film be considered an accurate representation of the book? Louisa May Alcott's expectation of what makes a good woman is firmly entrenched in the 19th century Christian morals, while Greta Gerwig's framing seems to subvert the book's social message. What do you think?
I don't know if it actively subverts it, because I think the idea of, Well, it comes down to Alcott's transcendentalism, and this idea of goodness and believing in goodness is very evident in Gerwig's movie. I think it's just been kind of reinterpreted through a modern and also, I guess, atheist lens, because there's really no religion in the movie. It's not that it's not there, but they never expressly discuss it. I mean, Amy's got like a cross on when she's grieving, but it's not really a big part of their lives the way that the book is. The book is so much about like God and best death. The reason that she's so okay with dying is because she says, well, it's God's plan for me. That's why I feel comfortable with it. So yeah, I don't know. Do you think it subverts it?
Not directly. I think Gerwig extracts from the religious aspect of the book in its morality, because I feel like in the book, faith and morality go hand in hand, and faith is quite a big reason why the family acts the way that they do. There's a hell of a lot of prayer. There's a lot of mention of God and Jesus throughout the book. But I think what Alcott perceived as morality in tandem with faith has been extracted exclusively as just moral and good faith in people and how lovely the people around them can be, and that they should be lovely to everybody else.
And just like Laura Dern.
Just Laura Dern.
The movie's just
Dern.
like, wouldn't it be great if we could all be a bit more like Laura Dern?
I think that's the best moral we can take from this film and any film that we see Laura Dern in.
Be more Laura Dern.
T-shirt printed.
It's our first bit of merch. It's just a T-shirt that says "Be more Laura Dern."
Yeah. Mary Palmer has asked, what did we think of the characterization of Amy? This is definitely the most bratty rendering I have seen. Did you read her as bratty?
Yeah, but she's quite bratty in the book as well. I think it's accurate in that sense.
Yeah, she's a little bit. I think the most bratty thing that I sort of point out that she does is it's almost the way that she reacts after she's burnt Joe's book, and she's quite aloof. And when I was reading the book, I always felt like she was dramatic beyond her years. I think that sort of it plays into that, but Florence Pugh's performance as Amy can seem quite bratty, especially when she won't go to the theatre with Joe and Meg, and the way that she reacts like immediately after she finds out, it is very bratty, to be fair. Yeah,
but I feel like so much of the book is her being like, oh, I wish we had money so I could buy like some crayons and and she's just whining the whole time. And then even when she's promising to Mommy that she'll be good, she does it in kind of a bratty way.
Like, did you not read that as a little bit sincere? Because it's even when she says she promises that she shouldn't be so selfish, I sort of felt that. Maybe in Gerwig's film. I didn't in the 90s. It felt quite insincere in the 90s film, but in Gerwig's film and the book, I felt that.
Yeah, but she says it in a kind of like somehow she says it in a self-centered way. Because it's all about her and how she's going to be so much good. She's going to be a perfect angel, and I don't know. It's like you said, she's a drama queen.
Yeah, okay, I will give you that. That's fair. And finally, again from our friend Rachel, how hard did you cry?
Oh my God, I remember when I saw it at the press screening, just like disgusting, sobbing, desperately trying to hide it so no one around me could see.
Honestly, I cried, I think, the first time I saw it, because I was in a packed theatre and I was on my own. And next to me was a completely full row of girls who seemed like they were the exact audience for the film, whereas I'm just there as a Ladybird stan. I stifled a cry the first time, and I think for the second and third times that I watched it, I capped at about 5 or 6 cries throughout the film.
When I rewatched it this week, I just fully sobbed the whole way through, but I think that's more to do with what's going on in my life right now. I mean, obviously the power of the movie unleashed it within me, but that may not be a normal amount of sobs for a normal viewing of Little Women.
To be honest, it gets me quite like that. As soon as I hit the play button, there's just something in me. Like, I get the butterflies, and I'm like, oh no.
And yeah, and it's just, I think it is, the performances are so perfect. They're so perfect to me. And Gerwig does such a good job of matching people to the characters that it just like, you're making me cry over Timothée Chalamet. What are you doing?
That's not right. She's breached the natural order by making us cry.
Usually
to Timothée
he's
Chalamet.
the guy who's like, rapping about statistics. You're making me cry over that guy?
Remembering Timothée Chalamet as the rapper.
As the statistics. Sorry, but like, I feel bad for him because that's like the curse of being the age that he is, that some embarrassing shit is on the internet and he can't delete it, and I feel really bad for him. And it's not fair, and we should never have seen it, but I've seen it now, and now all I can think about is statistics.
Sorry, Timothy. If you're listening, we're sorry that we saw that.
I wish I could delete it out of my brain, and I can't. But also, you keep dabbing at prestigious film events, so maybe it's fine.
So maybe he deserves it.
Maybe he's totally fine with us seeing it. I don't know him.
Yeah, but overall, I think Gerwig's Little Women is a really great adaptation of the book. It really effectively trims the fat while really effectively bringing out Gerwig's brilliant filmmaking touches and adding to the story that she had in the first place. It's easily one of my favourite films of all time, but I'm immensely impressed how effectively she was able to take this text and modernize it and make it a little bit scrappy and a little bit rough around the edges while still making it feel incredibly refined.
Yeah, and we kind of didn't delve into the time thing too much because I know people are very obsessed with the time structure. But that is like part of the genius of it, is the comparing and the contrasting of the scenes. And the one that always gets me is her running down the stairs, and the first time it's to see Beth well again, and then the second time, and it's like the same shot, but it's slower the second time, so you go, oh no. I could tell,
it's horrible.
like you could tell that something's up before it happens, and then you see Laura Dern, and then Laura Dern does the Laura Dern cry face, and then I'm done. I'm done.
I'm doing my cry face.
I'm tapping out. Too sad.
So, now that we've toppled Alcott's crowning achievement, that leaves the question of the next film and book we'll be taking on next month. And don't worry, it's a significantly shorter read.
Next month's subject for the Big Screen Book Club will be the very first film that earned cult favorite director Taika Waititi his very first Oscar, and I cried when he got it. It was a beautiful moment. The bold and charming number that Taika himself regards as a comedy with Nazis, Jojo Rabbit. The film was based on the novel Caging Skies by Christine Lunan, so we'll be reading that in May. You can find the book in your local bookshop, on your e-reader, or in audiobook form. And the film is available for rent from Prime Video.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the first episode of the Big Screen Book Club. It means a lot that you powered through the book and the movies and came back to listen to us talk about it. We really appreciate you coming back. If you want to keep in touch and stay in the loop with us, you can find us on Instagram and Twitter at BS Book Pod, and all of our episodes will be going out wherever you find your podcast. I'm Joseph Keim.
I'm Amy. Sorry, I'm not Amy. I'm Clarisse Lockgreen.
Glad we cleared that up. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Goodbye.